God gave Noah the rainbow sign. No more water the fire next time. Welcome to Positive Readings. Today, I'll be looking at James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. This is a short essay that's made up of two letters. The first one, quite short, to his nephew James. The second one, much longer and of more interest to me, is called Down at the Cross. This letter begins by talking about the religious crisis that James Baldwin went through at the age of 14. He describes this crisis as, I became, during my 14th year, for the first time in my life, afraid of the evil within me and afraid of the evil without. What I saw around me that summer in Harlem was what I had always seen. Nothing had changed. But now, without any warning, the whores and pimps and racketeers of the avenue had become a personal menace. It had not before occurred to me that I could become one of them, but now I realized that we had been produced by the same circumstances. Many of my comrades were clearly headed for the avenue, and my father said that I was headed that way too. My friends began to drink and smoke and embarked, at first avid, then groaning, on their sexual careers. So Baldwin begins by talking about this religious crisis that he had. He realizes that the circumstances that have produced these, we call whores, pimps, racketeers, this crime, this criminal element on the streets, that he's part of those circumstances. He could go that way as well, and that brings fear into him, that I need to do something so I don't end up going the way that so many others are going. I believe he begins this story with this story because, in part, throughout this essay, which isn't really filled with stories, it's mostly reflections. We got this story at the beginning. We have a story about Baldwin meeting Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam, who he doesn't support, but he has some sympathies for, based on this essay. But so he begins with this religious crisis because throughout this long letter, there's a message about action and the fact that evil does not come into the world, or the world isn't ruined through evil. It's actually ruined through I think he uses the term spinelessness, not acting, kind of sitting by and letting things happen without actually thinking about the conditions that you're in and how you could be one of those pimps and whores that he saw on the street, and how you have to actively do something to change this. So that's partly the theme, I think, of this letter. It's written in a style very much like Baldwin's other essays. He was trained as a preacher. He talks about that as well in here a bit, and you can see that he has a way of the anaphora, this repetition of the same sentence structures. As you read this, it definitely feels like this could be read aloud, almost as a sermon. Another theme throughout this essay is the focus on the pathologies of white people. He says here, white people in this country will have quite enough to do in learning how to accept and love themselves and each other, When they have achieved this, which will not be tomorrow and may very well be never, the Negro problem will no longer exist, for it will no longer be needed. So he looks at racism as being a necessary condition for white people to deal with their inner contradictions, their fears. Developing this theme later in the essay, he says, a vast amount of energy that goes into what we call the Negro problem is produced by the white man's profound desire not to be judged by those who are not white, not to be seen as he is. And at the same time, a vast amount of the white anguish is rooted in the white man's equally profound need to be seen as he is, to be released from the tyranny of his mirror. So again, we get this contradiction or theme of contradiction that both not wanting to be judged, but at the same time wanting the evil to be seen, to be free of that evil that you might be hiding. Baldwin diagnoses this problem, as I've stated, as one of a psychological psychological problem on a mass social scale. But he also offers a solution, or at least implies one. He says here, the white man's unadmitted and apparently to him unspeakable private fears and longings are projected on the Negro. So again, this is the problem. This is kind of how he's defining racism. The only way he can be released from the Negro's tyrannical power over him is to consent, in effect, to become black himself, to become a part of that suffering and dancing country that he now watches wistfully from the heights of his lonely power, and armed with spiritual traveler's checks, visits surreptitiously after dark. And I think that latter reference there is the whites who go in and visit, say, Harlem or other parts of the city. Again, this is in the 1960s, where you might have more like jazz clubs and partying of that sort. But they're going there just to visit, to be part of that nightlife, but not actually to be part of that life. And he's saying that, again, as I read this, the solution is he has to become black himself. The white man has to become black himself. This is a very different message than you get when you hear people talk about race today. They tend to focus on the fact that we need to identify our race, celebrate our race, kind of almost divide people by their race. This here is not that, right? It's saying that we need to become black. What does it mean to become black? Baldwin does not actually say in this. He does talk a little bit about the psychology of how racism affects black people. He states the psychological effects of being black in America as in a society that is entirely hostile and by its nature seems determined to cut you down, that has cut down so many in the past and cuts down so many every day, it begins to be almost impossible to distinguish a real from a fancied injury. So this process of being cut down, as he said, being put down, being discriminated against, makes the victim eventually does not know when real discrimination from imagined discrimination, which we can imagine would be a very dangerous and unpleasant position to be in. So that's one insight Baldwin offers for what it means to be black. Another one, he refers to black people as a kidnapped pagan. And then more interestingly, he says, I cannot accept the proposition that the 400-year travail of the American Negro should result merely in his attainment of the present level of the American civilization. I am far from convinced that being released from the African witch doctor was worthwhile if I am now, in order to support the moral contradictions and the spiritual aridity of my life, expected to become dependent on the American psychiatrists. It is a bargain I refuse. So he seems to be identifying what he calls the American Negro, the kidnapped pagan, as being outside of this system of internal contradictions that needs to have what he calls the American psychiatrist in order to get through and live through these types of contradictions. I don't think this is a anarcho-primitive endorsement calling for a return back to that pagan, but maybe looking at the other ways of, or more traditional ways of being, as being more productive than what you're currently getting in American society. I also think this might be a critique of, especially in the 1960s, maybe of the Christian kind of the idea of America being a Christian nation, yet at war around the world. And again, those kind of contradictions that he's saying he does not want to live with those. That's not the goal, just to become like white Americans of the 1960s. Again, talking about a solution, this is getting near the end of the essay, he says, and this is also the part blurbed on the back, which again, I think in some ways goes against some of the sentiment I see about race today. He says, in short, we, the black and white, deeply need each other here if we are really to become a nation, if we are really, that is, to achieve our identity, our maturity as men and women. To create one nation has proved to be a hideously difficult task. There is certainly no need now to create two, one black and one white. And sometimes it feels like in current times that's what some people might want. And I'm with Baldwin in thinking that is not the way, not the answer. Bringing the book back to the religious crisis, which for Baldwin was first a fervent jump into religion and then a disillusionment of religion. At the very end of this essay, he says, color is not a human or a personal reality. It is a political reality. But this is a distinction so extremely hard to make that the West has not been able to make it yet. And at the center of this dreadful storm, this vast confusion, stand the black people of this nation, who must now share the fate of a nation that has never accepted them, to which they were brought in chains. Well, if this is so, one has no choice but to do all in one's power to change that fate. And at no matter what risk, eviction, imprisonment, torture, death, for the sake of one's children, in order to minimize the bill that they must pay, one must be careful not to take refuge in any delusion. And the value placed on the color of the skin is always and everywhere and forever a delusion. So we must be brave. We must not be spineless, right? Because that's what's going to lead to the real evils. And we must face our delusions, not build them up into greater delusions. This essay, Down at the Cross, opens with a reference to Rudyard Kipling's The White Man's Burden. And this is followed by Down at the Cross, which is a hymn. I believe this, beginning this way, the intention here is to set the theme, which is really continued throughout the rest of this letter, this essay, of the contradictions. One that exists of a power an aggressor trying to change a marginal group, and that marginal group maybe taking the best that comes from that power. In this case, maybe the religious spirit, the hymns, the sadness that comes in some of these songs, and using that to ultimately resist that power until it sees its own failures and its own wrongs, so it can adapt and mold into the hymn. James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time.